Welcome to Get the Elephants Out of the Room. I'm Chris Webber. We all have to deal with difficult people at work, difficult managers, difficult colleagues and difficult customers. In this podcast, we share stories and experiences of people like you who face these challenges and share their secrets to success. Our mission is to help everyone overcome obstacles and to become more confident, better communicators. So sit back and relax while we unravel the mysteries of another difficult person. Mary, it's wonderful for you to come and join the podcast, and thank you for agreeing to doing an in-person podcast.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here. It's a real treat.
It is an unusual treat for us this afternoon. So thank you very much. So first of all, talk to us about who you are. Tell us who you are and what you do.
Okay, so I'm Mary Gregory, and I tend to work with leaders who are navigating complex change, could be big change, and that could be change in their life, in their career, or leading a team and change within the organisations within which they work.
Okay.
And when it's within the organisations, I tend to work strategically to help them think about where the organisation is going and how they want their team and themselves as a leader to navigate what needs to happen. And what I offer them is a space to really think, that sort of quality space that's so often missing in our very busy lives, but also tools and perspectives that will help them think much more clearly and make much more strategic decisions around things.
Okay, interesting. So how did you get there?
How did I get to be there? Right, I also wanted to mention, actually, if you don't mind, I've also got a special interest in gender diversity.
Okay. Yeah.
So that is an area that I do a lot of work with. I support women in terms of how they can navigate bias and step up as leaders in the workplace, but also support organisations create cultures that are much more open to everyone thriving, not just one particular gender. So that's something else I do as well.
And we'll come back to that because I think it's a very interesting topic that I'd like to explore with you.
It is. So you ask how I got there. Going way back, my career started in the health NHS actually, where I was an occupational therapist and I specialised in child and family psychiatry. So I worked as a play psychotherapist for about 5 years, right at the beginning of my career. So all my work is kind of still rooted in my understanding of human behaviour, how people show up, defence mechanisms, all those sorts of things, and how they play out in the context of an organisation, but also in the context of ourselves when we're having to navigate our careers and be a leader.
So you started in the NHS, and how did you leave the NHS? How did you get into...
Well, this is way back in my 20s. I got to the point where the NHS was struggling. There were all sorts of, I think it was a Tory government at the time. I think it was Margaret Thatcher, actually, because I remember going on a march at that point. And there was the introduction of the Sainsbury's report and treating patients like products, which was very difficult to work with in the NHS and didn't really work, treating human beings as particular products. So I got burnt out. I found I was working very, very hard, very passionate about what I did. I mean, supporting children and their families to develop healthy psychodynamics and become well as a family unit. That was really something, but it was very, very exhausting. And I found it increasingly difficult to separate myself from the patients I was working with then, and keeping a boundary with myself at home. And I actually got really burnt out. So I then went off into the travel business, complete contrast, and went and worked in the travel business, firstly as an overseas holiday rep, so frontline customer service, and then I got into learning and development and training of overseas staff and leaders. So that's where I started getting interested in leadership development.
So you talked a bit about psychology and behaviour. So tell us a bit about then some of your philosophies. What do you bring to the people that you work with?
Yes, so I have a real grounding in the whole psychological view of things, and I'm very fond and use still in my work today a model called Transactional Analysis, which I actually write about in my book Ego. And I think what's useful about that is it encourages us to look at our behaviour and our communication and understand what's going on more about when we're communicating and where we might get activated and react rather than respond to a situation. So I'd say that is a real grounding that's almost intuitive to me now in terms of how I might work with my clients. And of course, the whole thing about leadership is it's not just about being yourself and being being egotistical. It's all about me and I want to be this mighty leader. It's actually about the impact you have on others and those around you. Mm-hmm. And if you want to be an effective leader, there's a real need for you to have some self-understanding and self-awareness and being willing to do some work on yourself and keep working on yourself. Because the more you do that, the more positive the impact is going to be, mm-hmm. the more capable you're going to be of being able to respond to different personalities, different preferences, different situations. It's going to give you much more agility as a leader. The more you have that self-understanding, the more you've worked out what are the things that might potentially trigger you and also potentially limit you as well.
So transactional analysis, that's the parent-adult child.
It is,
stuff,
yes.
Right? So this is the idea that we want to have, or I guess my understanding of it is that people want to have an adult-to-adult conversation with people where you can be nuanced and you can discuss and debate ideas and topics, but we often fall into these different profiles. The parental profile, which is a bit more telling, right? So it's telling and black or white, right or wrong, and then child, which is a little bit more subservient and reactive.
Not necessarily always subservient.
Okay.
Child can also be quite aggressive, but what signifies the difference between parent and child is that parent is more aggressive in terms of power over. So I want to be controlling of you, I want to have power over you, because you think about parents, they tend to want to be just looking after their kids and using that as the metaphor, looking after their children, being in control. So it's all about power over when you're coming from that parent place. Mm. When you're coming from child, it's often feeling powerless. Now that can cause all sorts of emotions. So the emotions might be, I'm going to just stop and go along with, to keep myself safe. Or it might be, I'm going to fight against and get really angry here in the moment.
Like a tantrum.
Yeah, like a tantrum. And you could probably yourself think of situations where in the workplace people might have, that they coin that phrase, throwing their toys out of the pram. It's like people have a reaction and they behave in a way that isn't necessarily going to help them be effective or successful in that situation. So we go between the two, and adult is the maturer kind of the developed place, that we've learned in terms of how to keep control of ourselves, deal with what is actually happening in the moment rather than being hooked from past experiences, which both the other ego states relate to our past.
Okay, so that's based upon what we've learned at some point in our lives. Okay. And so what we want to really talk about today is I'm really curious about then how we put some of this into action, because obviously the podcast is about difficult people at work, and I'm curious to think about your experiences of how you've seen this play out, and kind of what you've learned, because I guess we're all enriched by the lessons that we've learned through our own experiences.
Yes, and we've all got our own stories, haven't we?
So when I say to you the idea of difficult people at work, what and who does that remind you of at moments in your life?
Oh, difficult people at work. So people who may manipulate. I think there is a definite movement towards more effective leadership, although there's still a lot of work to do. And I think there's a movement towards more positive behaviour in the workplace and more awareness around how important behaviour is. And there's still a lot of work to do. Mm-hmm. So how it might play out is people who are maybe manipulative, who may play power games. So often you see in organisations what I would call a power play going on. So somebody patronising somebody else, for example, to make that other person look small and for them to look more powerful in that situation. In meetings, you will see all sorts of dynamics going on in the room and all sorts of different egos playing out in that space. And I absolutely know that for sure, if you want to have a successful conversation, the more you can get into that more calm, collected, data-driven adult place, the more effective that interaction is going to be. But it's not just that, because what I also know goes on in the workplace, and not just in the workplace, in life. So some of the things we're talking about apply to our relationships outside of work as well. But there are all sorts of games that go on. So we talk about power play. That is an example of a game going on. And the way to try and avoid games and be adult as much as possible is to what I would call contract. So in your working relationships, be really clear with people about expectations. And, you know, say you and I are working together, what do you require of me in our working relationships? What are the deadlines? When do they need to be? What do I do if for some reason it's delayed? Mm-hmm. All those sorts of things. And what are the behavioural expectations? There's lots of things that are unwritten in organisations. It's all implicit. Yeah. Like, you know, it's implicit that we'll be respectful to each other. Yeah. But that doesn't always happen. Yeah. You know, so being really clear about what behaviours are acceptable and not acceptable is all part of the contracting.
Yeah, and I think, you know, what I notice when I talk to people is conflict about what the understanding of those implicit things are.
Yeah.
And like, there's a good example of dress code that you can go back 30 years. When I started working, there was an expectation that people were wearing shirts and ties and suits.
Yeah.
And now we're not in that world, but some people are. So there are still some professions and some people who still insist on dress code. But that's a good example of where you could see an unwritten conflict, I guess, that you might think about, where there's potential status games being played about who's wearing the right stuff and who's not. And I think that's really interesting. And, you know, I remember thinking to myself, or I think I read an article that you used to be able to tell who the wealthy people were in the meeting because they were wearing the expensive suits and ties. Now you can spot a billionaire because they're wearing a hoodie.
That's a great way of putting it. Yeah, things have changed.
And so I guess that's an example of kind of stuff that creates unwritten rules that cause problems.
And that's what also contributes to the culture and the atmosphere of the organisation. So there's kind of different invisible currency that goes on within organisations as well. I can think of one organisation I worked with where there was a shortage of meetings rooms. So the director who had the most meeting space was the most powerful director because everybody wanted to keep on their good side so that they'd let them use their meeting rooms. Yeah, so it's quite extraordinary, the things that go on.
Yeah, no, well, I think it is and I think it isn't. I think when you start to look at it through the lens of psychology and behavioural elements, it's probably not surprising the games that people notice. And I guess perhaps that's the challenge you have when you're engaging with clients. Certainly when I talk to people, you can start to understand why people are behaving the way that they are when you understand it through that lens of, you know, let's say this example of meeting room space. That becomes territory, right? That becomes power. It's you use the word currency, and so I have this currency, so I'm powerful and wealthy in this organisation, and then the idea of losing that is threatening to them. So anyone who then says we're going to even out who has the meeting rooms, that's a threat.
That's
to them.
Immediately a threat, and so that then this is where ego comes into play, because, you know, I write about ego and I talk about it, and ego is our defense mechanism. It's a whole system of different defenses that each of us has developed individually, and it's unique to us. But as soon as we feel threatened or our social anxiety increases, our ego comes into play. So whenever there's fear around ego, there's a risk that ego will come into play. And that's why the self-awareness piece is so important, because it may work for you. You know, there's a whole leadership thing, isn't there, about my way or the highway, very autocratic leadership. You're just going to do it my way. Mm-hmm. That might work in a crisis when we need to get out the building because the place is on fire, but it's not going to work long term in the complex times that we live in. Yeah. There's going to be a cost to it that people will eventually say, I'm going to walk because I don't feel I get any recognition or my ideas aren't being encouraged, all that sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. So that, you know, ego in the short term can work for us, but in the long term, there are always risks attached to it as well.
Because they clash.
Yeah, because there's advantages. Part of my ego is I want to please people, you know. So that's an ego strategy for me to help me feel safe. Works for me in terms of social situations and social etiquette, but long term, if I'm asking for my needs to make, or if I want to address conflict, this is a common one with conflict, it causes me all sorts of stress to actually have to sit down and have a tricky conversation with somebody. Yeah, you know, although I've had to learn to do it.
Well, let's go there, because before we started recording, we talked about one of your experiences where you learned the most, and it's almost exactly this case where you talked about somebody that you would, you know, your keenness to please became a challenge in the way that So tell us that story, share that
Oh
experience.
so it was a difficult interaction, and in terms of where we were on parent-child, there was definitely a case of her being very parental and very pointing the finger and annoyed and aggressive towards me.
Mm-hmm.
And I went into that fearful, oh my goodness, this is really difficult to be in this conversation, scared place. And the thing about our communication is, the topic of the conversation was the fact I hadn't called her when I said I would. So hands up, I knew I was guilty. I think it was one of those days where you'd been really busy and I just hadn't got round to calling her. And she was really annoyed about that. So the fact of the matter was, I was the guilty party in that interaction, but what didn't work was the interaction about it. So she got very accusatory, she was being very judgmental, which is typical parental type communication, you know. Who do you think you are? You said you would call me, you didn't, all sorts of stuff. And I literally felt like a rabbit in the headlights, almost pinned against the wall. Yeah. Now, this wasn't, you know, I was a developed coach at this point, so it wasn't like I was very young in my career. I can remember thinking, oh my goodness, this is a really difficult conversation. I've got to try and get myself into a decent place to deal with it. Yeah. So I took some breaths, I tried to get myself into an adult place, and I said, just a minute, this is turning into a really emotive conversation. Can we just explore what's actually happening here? I was trying to get us into the moment, which failed completely. So it was a complete failure of dealing with a difficult conversation, because she just continued on with it. Yeah. And it was a phone conversation, which probably made it even more difficult. I can't remember how we concluded it, but it was really, she got the upper hand. So talk about power over. Yeah. She certainly had power over in that dynamic. But when we put the phone down, I felt absolutely exhausted by it. And I remember sitting in my chair thinking, oh my goodness, what just happened there? You know, and in terms of being in a good place to do work at that point, which is what, you know, organisations want people to be in a good place. And she was a senior leader in the organisation I was working in. So it's like, not great leadership behaviour. So to me, that's an example of behaviour that really doesn't work. Yes, I was in the wrong. Yes, we needed to sort that out, and I needed to apologise, and we needed to work out how we could communicate better in the future. But the way it was dealt with, I mean, I'm making her wrong by talking about it like this, but the way she behaved in that interaction completely closed me down. Yeah. And made it, it was impossible to make any headway in the conversation.
And I think this is a very important story, because I don't think it's unusual. I think there's plenty of people listening to this episode who will see themselves in that, either on one or other side of the conversation, that they picked up the phone and they bawled someone out because they didn't do what they were supposed to do. Yeah. They missed a deadline, they didn't fulfill a promise. But equally, people on your side of the phone call saying, wow, I got this and it came completely out of the blue, and it made me feel really small. Yeah. and really intimidating.
It affected my performance. That's the thing. That's what we need to get, is these interactions affect performance. So my concentration was shot. I had to go and make myself a cup of tea. I had to take some time out. Whereas I could have been doing other valuable work at that moment. And if that's the culture you're creating, where those sorts of conversations are happening repeatedly, you're going to have real issues with your performance as an organisation and as a business. So that's why this is so important.
And I think that's really interesting, because you've talked already about currency and power in organisations. So if you can accumulate some currency, you can accumulate some power, you gain authority and status in that organisation. And that can be seen as a good thing. And organisations can and do encourage that. They encourage their executives and their leaders and their people to say, you know, this is an organisation that respects the ones who have authority and power, and that's the way we should deal with. And they kind of build this idea that the ones who are able to shout at someone else and win are the winners in our organisation. We want them. And what they've actually created is a constant war zone where everyone is shouting at each other, everyone is playing these destructive, high conflict power games. We can talk about it being negative, but culturally, do you have to deal with this kind of scenario where people are kind of encouraging this kind of behaviour, this authority?
Well, I think that if that is the culture of the organisation, they're going to have real issues long term, because it might be, in terms of quick fix, it might be fixing things for them in the moment, but longer term, people are going to talk with their feet and aren't going to tolerate. People aren't going to feel safe in that organisation. That will impact the quality of innovation that can come back, the quality that people can push back and talk freely, come in with their ideas, learn from failures. All of that is going to be very impactful on the organisation's results. If I'm working with an organisation, I think I would need to start, particularly around culture, start at the top and look at what are the dynamics that are going on in that top team. Because usually they're reflected lower down in the organisation.
Yeah.
So are people in the top team really pulling together? And it is about realising, you might be in sales, you might be in customer service, whatever it is, you're all in service of the same goal, which is the organisation's performance, the organisation's success.
Yeah.
So it's like finding that common denominator and pulling together, and it needs to happen at that executive level for it to really start working.
So when you think back about that situation now, and recognising you tried to make it an adult-to-adult conversation, what are your lessons from that, and what are your recommendations for people listening who find themselves in that situation?
Well, I think hindsight is such a wonderful thing, isn't it? So looking back, there are different options that come into them. I think, and I shared one with you earlier on, which I could have stopped the conversation much earlier and actually say, the tone that you're using with me isn't working. Can we revisit this conversation either later today or tomorrow, whenever it's when we both had a chance to take a breath? That would have been one way. The other thing would have been just to have let her express as much as she needed to express.
Yeah.
And then when she'd done, because there is that thing of, you get to the point where you can't say anymore. So if someone's not reacting to you, to just be in that sort of neutral place of listening to her.
Yeah.
And when she's done, then coming in a much more adult space. Whereas I think my mistake was I tried to interject being adult
Too soon,
I think. I needed to let it out first.
I met someone years ago who suggested that there's a great mediation technique where people who have a conflict between them, you give them 10 minutes protected time, and they have 10 minutes to vent everything they want about the person that they have a problem with. And they said usually they run out of steam way before 10 minutes.
Yes.
Because it's actually a long time to be that frustrated and that angry. And so it's quite interesting. That sprung to mind when you said about allowing her to just...
Yeah, and what that brings to mind for me is way back when I was a holiday rep, some customer coming to me complaining about they didn't like the hotel, the whole thing they didn't like.
Yeah.
And I remember just, again, that pin against the wall moment, just listening. I just listened. And then I remember seeing this same customer later in the week thinking, oh no, it's him again. I want to avoid him, sort of thing. But he came and shook my hand, said, I just want to say thank you for listening. I think I sorted out what the issues were. Yeah. Everything's fine now. And so just listening, I think, makes such a difference.
Do you know, I teach a lot about respect and building trust with particularly customer relationships. And one of the things that drives disrespect is to not feel listened to, is to not feel heard. And often when particularly if we feel on a lower status and a lower power dynamic, there's a sense that people are not listening to me. Just being heard can make such a big difference to how people feel and engage. And if you feel powerless, if you're in a hotel, I'm actually going to put myself in this guy's shoes, that he's in a hotel with his family, they've saved up this year for their holiday, and they get there, and things are not as they expect, right? The room isn't quite what they expected, and the facilities are not quite what they expected. So now he's got, say, a wife and children complaining to him. He's completely powerless, right? He's booked it, they are where they are. Right at that moment, perhaps the most important thing for him is to feel heard.
Yes, and that's what happened in that scenario. And I think you've also flagged another, another really important area, which is the definition of an upset, is unmet expectations. So whenever there's conflict, it's usually somewhere at the root is an expectation I had of you or had of the situation that hasn't been met. So then I will get upset about it.
So I have a question. There's an understanding that I had, and I want to check it with you, which is that if one person goes into parental mode, it drives the other into child. Is that true, or is that a myth?
I think that's part of the dynamics that go on. Is that and this is all unconscious. It's not like I'm intentionally going into parent and the other person's intentionally going into child. It is part of the dynamics. You can get people going into parent and then being met with someone else going into parent, and then you get a real heavy conflict going on as well. But the dynamic often, the most common one, is that I'm going to have power over you and therefore I feel powerless. And you look at lots of the dynamics in organisations is that there's a hierarchy, that the people at the top have the power. So what they say and what they do is important, more important than what people might say and do further down the organisation. So the dynamic then becomes parent-child. Now, if you're a leader of a team and you've got people who are behaving in that much more childlike dynamic, it's going to be really hard work because they'll be much more likely to be dependent on you, to be yes people, and that's not what you want if you want an effective organisational culture. You need a culture where everybody feels like they are growing, they're developing, they're able to contribute fully to the success of the organisation. And if they're just doing what you're telling them to do, that's not what it looks like.
Yeah, and this is where people complain, if I'm not here, nothing gets done.
Yeah.
And they don't understand that they're generating this need.
Yeah, if you're a leader who isn't delegating, that is a sure sign you're a controlling parental type leader.
One of the key factors in trust, I believe, in business relationships is about credibility and empowerment.
Yes.
And we want people who are experienced and knowledgeable about what they're going to do, but we also need people who are empowered to do what they're supposed to do.
Yes.
And I think that's one of the failings of organisations at times is they recruit credible people with great qualifications and great experience, but they don't allow them to get on with the job. And that disempowerment then, I guess, creates a sense of dependence and childhoodness.
Yes, and that's not what you want. And I also want to flag that, saying, if you're being a parental controlling leader, that's how you're being. It's not about you're a wrong, bad person for being that way. It's how we've psychologically evolved and developed and starting to become aware that, oh gosh, I can be very controlling in this situation, then gives you a choice to actually, rather than just, if one of my team members comes to me with a problem, rather than just telling them what to do, I'm going to actually ask a question, which is a much more adult way to approach that conversation and completely shifts the dynamic in your team just by asking a question. What have you done so far? What are you thinking about around this? Tell me a bit more about the context.
Yeah.
That's more of a coaching approach as a leader.
Yeah.
It just opens up the whole capacity and potential of your team.
So let's change the subject a little, go to a pet subject for you.
Yeah.
Talk to me then about why this is relevant when it comes to gender diversity and what the differences are in terms of how important it is to understand these dynamics.
Well, I think, there are so when it comes to diversity and to gender, it's so nuanced and so subtle. And I also want to be really clear that it's not about one gender's better or worse than the other. And in this whole scenario, we've all been brought up and socialised in a certain way. Organisations traditionally grew up in the Victorian industrial age, and they were developed by men. And so what's happened there is systems and cultures have been created that work really well for men. They don't necessarily work so well for women. So there's lots of embedded bias that goes on within that system. And there's also societal expectations and norms of how a man should be and how a woman should be. So a lot of the latest research demonstrates, for example, if a woman is direct, if she's assertive, that does not land well. So you're thinking about influencing, a woman who's wanting to be a leader and want to influence. If she's overly direct and really assertive, it doesn't land well.
Well, no, it's seen as aggressive.
Seen
right?
as aggressive, it's seen as bossy. Whereas for a man to do that it's seen as leadership.
Confidence.
Good, confident leadership.
Yes.
So straight away there are biases like that, and for women to have to work at being relational, because that is the expectation. I mean, for me, it's not such a big deal because I am relational and I am much more into, how can we work this out so it'll land and that sort of stuff. But it feels like it's a really imbalanced way that, if a woman is much more direct, she gets penalised for it. She, rather than, on the one hand, we're encouraging women to lean in and to step up. But then when they do, they then get penalised for being too bossy. So that's like, it's like damned if you do, damned if you don't. So that's how one way it affects the dynamic.
Yeah. What's your advice for me as a man working with female leaders to be more gender aware? And I like to think that I'm probably gender aware. I have a daughter, and so I like to think that I try to be inclusive. But what's your advice?
This is a very common phenomenon that women experience, which is in the meeting setting when they're at work, is as a male leader, sit back and notice what is happening in this meeting. Because one of the most common phenomena that women experience is, on the one hand, they get talked over. And women find it difficult to speak up in those meetings anyway, because there's all that expectation of damned if you do, damned if you don't. So notice, are women participating actually, first of all? How safe is this meeting for women to participate? What's going on amongst the male egos that means that one person may be dominating or whatever? Invite women to participate. If a woman steps forward, does participate and shares an idea, acknowledge her idea, because another phenomena is that women will come in with an idea and it completely gets overlooked. And then 15 minutes later, a man might present the same idea.
Yeah. That's in that cartoon.
Yeah, that absolutely happens. So making sure that person gets acknowledged, I think, is really important. But I think the real secret is to step back and look and observe and notice, and then think, where do we need to give some attention to make sure everybody's participating? Because there may be men in the meeting that aren't participating, but let's make sure everyone is included in this conversation.
And do you see differences around industry? So in certain industries, do you see bigger problems than others, or would you be aware of bigger problems than others?
I think that, so I'm thinking about different organisations I've worked with, and I've certainly worked with organisations that have part of the workforce, not all of it, but part of the workforce is blue collared, and some of the bias and the overt sexism that has gone on in organisations like that. And we're talking several years ago, so that might have shifted since then. So I don't want to bad mouth or point fingers at people, but it is something to be aware of, that women have actually had to put up with some really awful, blatant sexism at times. I don't know if that, because I'm not working with those types of organisations at the moment, I'm not conscious that is still apparent, and I also think that doesn't mean there isn't bias going on. I think it's a lot more subtle. So I can think of a financial institution I've worked with, and it's almost like I go as a coach to coach women there, to support them to navigate the bias. And some of the stories I hear there are women who are working really, really hard, because women also have to prove themselves so much more to demonstrate their competency. And then they watch their male colleague who hasn't done as much get promoted. That is classic, and that still goes on a hell of a lot. And I've even think of someone recently who supported a male colleague. He was struggling, and she supported him to navigate a difficult situation. She did the work, she supported and coached him to take whatever action he needed to take. And lo and behold, he got the promotion, she didn't. That goes on a lot.
There's a TED talk that comes to my mind about leaning, and it's the Sheryl Sandberg TED talk, and one of the things she talks about in there is keep our hands raised as women, because she shared an example of giving a talk at work at Facebook and saying, I'll take one more question, taking one question, then all the women put their hands down, and then she took more questions, but only for men, because they kept their hands up. And one of her team came to her and said, what's your lesson from this? And she said, keep my hand up. And she hadn't noticed. And it sounds there's a bit of that goes on. I think
I think it does.
There's a bit of like men play outside the rules, and what I notice at times is that women don't. They play the rules. It says this is what I'm supposed to do, so this is what I did. Whereas the men are doing other stuff, whatever that other stuff might be, networking or relationship building or whatever, which I think is an interesting challenge. And I think to me that's the important element, and you touched on it earlier on too, that organisations which are built on power dynamics only, status-driven organisations, they're missing, I think, a whole aspect. For me, successful organisations are ones which balance results and relationships. So when I'm advising people on negotiations, if you're about to sign a 5-year contract, then you better like the people that you're signing a contract with, because you're stuck with them. If you're dealing with someone and you expect in 10 years' time to still be dealing with them because they're an important industry partner, a big retailer, for example, then you better like them. And the power plays destroy that. You're missing the whole aspect of a key part of the relationship. And to me, that's one of the things that women are really good at. They're really good at balancing results and relationships. They are able to connect more on those elements. And so my advice often is that listen to the women around the table, because they're the ones who are advising you how to keep a relationship alive, despite the fact that you have just leveraged something in a deal.
Yes, that's a really good summary, actually. And you reminded me of a podcast conversation I had on my own podcast yesterday, which we were talking about leadership, and my guest kept saying leadership fundamentally is about taking charge and taking care. And from the gender perspective, women often get the taking care aspect, men get the taking charge. And the recognition within the organisation goes to those who take charge rather than those that take care. And actually you need both. You can't do one without the other. Women can't just take care and not take charge. It needs to be both. And I think that's a really good example of that, in that you need to play the long game here. This is a long-term client, long-term partner. How do we build the relationship whilst forwarding the action and taking charge as well?
Beautiful. Thank you very much. It's been such a really interesting conversation, and we could have dug so much more into these topics.
We could talk all day with you, I think.
We could talk all day. Thank you for sharing your stories and your experiences. If people want to get in touch with you to talk about more about the work that you do and find out more, give us some more information. Where is your book available as well? So my book's available on Amazon, and so look for it there. Or if you want to get in touch with me, I'm always very happy to give books away as well. And you can contact me on LinkedIn. So that's my main place. And I've also got Mary at marygregory.com. And then also my She Leads Collective podcast, which is a seasonal podcast. I'm just launching season 2 at the moment. So it's gone out today, actually, my first episode of season 2. So excellent. So we'll put your links into the show notes as well, so people can find you. Thank you very much, Mary. Great conversation. Thank you. Thanks for listening. I hope you took away some useful insights. Join us again next time when we unpick the behaviours of more difficult people. Until then, take care and see you soon.